The Quarry by Jon Peters. It was late May 2022 when our group made its annual camping trip. There are 5 of us. Me, my name is Tim, my girlfriend from college, Jasmine, my best friend and roommate, Eric, his girlfriend, Lacey, and my childhood best friend, Vance, who we called Big Irish. Vance was 6'7", about 240 pounds, and he had fire red hair that fell to his shoulders. Except for Vance, we had all met at Arizona State University. We began our annual camping trips while we were sophomores at ASU. We all had love for the outdoors, and on our first trip, we had settled on a nearby state park. We graduated in the spring of 2022, and as a celebration we decided to go camping in a different state. We chose to camp in the lower Sierra Nevada mountains in Southern California. The area we chose was thick in forest and short on civilization. The drive was long, but that was okay with us. We were cramped into my 2018 white Ford Transit van, and while it looked like the type of car a retired cop would drive, it was perfect for camping trips. I paid for it after I graduated college with money left over from my student loans. It was summertime, and long road trips were something we all loved to do. We'd each put in a time off request from our jobs, and we were going to be gone for an entire week. We started out from Phoenix before dawn. The ride was fun and relaxing. We were in our primes with our futures ahead of us. None of us were prepared for what would happen on the second night of our adventure. We finally pitched camp about 8 p.m. on a Saturday night. We were tired from the drive, but in good spirits. That first night, after setting up our tents and making a quick dinner on the propane stove Eric brought, we built a large fire in the fire pit and then passed around a bottle of Jim Beam. Eric and Lacey were in their own tent, as were Jasmine and I, and Vance brought his solo tent. Everyone was passed out before 2 a.m. The next morning after breakfast, we hiked along a bumpy road that heads south through the woods. We were surrounded by tall pines and Douglas fir trees. Songbirds chirped excitedly through the morning sky, and we stopped and listened to a woodpecker knocking against a tree somewhere close by. Suddenly, we were looking down at a giant quarry. The cliff we were standing on was at least 30 feet high. A trail led from where we were standing. It zigzagged down the cliff wall until it ended at the base of the cliff in the bluest water any of us had ever seen. None of us knew the quarry was there. There were no signs, and it wasn't on the map of the area that I downloaded onto my phone. The water level looked like it was high enough to swim, and even though we didn't have our swimsuits with us, we all agreed that the water would be refreshing after our hike. It wouldn't be the first time we'd skinny dipped with each other, and we were comfortable with our bodies. We took the well-worn switchback trail that led down to the water. The water was cold, but it was clear and deep, and despite the cold, we swam for almost an hour. We hadn't seen another person yet, which we thought unusual given that the quarry was an ideal place to relax and cool off during the summer days. We didn't think much about it, though, as we were just happy to be spending time with one another in the wilderness. It was as we were hiking back up the trail that Lacey suddenly stopped. I almost ran into her. She was looking out over the quarry to the northeast side. "Are those 2 watching us?" she asked, a note of doubt in her voice. She was pointing to the opposite cliff of the quarry, and we all turned our heads to look. There were 2 people standing at the edge of the quarry, and they were looking right at us. We couldn't judge their age because they had on white oval masks with black eye holes. One was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with a wide frame, and the other was a head shorter, slight and rigid. They were both wearing blue jeans that cut off at the knees. The taller person also wore a ragged gray t-shirt, while the shorter person, who I figured was a girl, due to her height and her petite frame and long blonde hair, wore a faded white sleeveless t-shirt. Vance gave them a wave, and when they didn't respond, Eric hollered, "Hello!" His voice echoed around the quarry. The 2 masked people continued to stare at us as we continued up the trail. "Let's just get out of here," Lacey said, a slight tremble in her voice. "Those guys are giving me the creeps." We got back to camp in the early afternoon, and besides a few redneck jokes, we'd forgotten about the two weirdos at the quarry. We ate a big lunch, and then we cleared off the fold-out table and set up our favorite board game, Dead of Winter. It was a game filled with zombies and outlaws. We played 2 games back to back, and when we finished playing, the sun was behind the trees and the day was cool enough to require light jackets. We took a hike on the dirt road we'd come in on, listening to the trees creak in the wind and the occasional cawing of crows. When we arrived back at camp, it was dark. We gathered around the campfire again, and after gathering firewood that we'd brought with us, we had a roaring inferno going. Flames licked at the night, and we sat around the fire, passing whiskey around and telling stories of previous camping trips. Loves lost and loves gained. Vance passed a joint around, and by 9 o'clock we were drunk and stoned. None of us had cell service, but that was to be expected when camping in the mountains. It didn't matter to us, though, as we were there to enjoy nature, not sit around browsing the internet. In fact, Jasmine and I had put our phones inside the tent, and besides checking the time, I hadn't used it once since we arrived the day before. The first to retire was Big Irish. He lumbered and swayed toward his tent. 30 minutes later, Eric and Lacey retired. Jasmine and I stayed up for another hour, looking at the stars and making out. Jasmine was 4'11" and 95 pounds. She was short but with a tight body. She had 2 tattoos on her light brown skin, a bright golden sun on her right shoulder blade, and a ghostly crouching panther running down her left forearm. As I marveled at the night sky above, holding hands with Jasmine, she gave me a gentle kiss on my neck. I squeezed her thigh, and without saying a word, we retired to our tent. From the sounds of it, Eric and Lacey were also getting intimate. I felt bad for Vance as he was by himself. He hadn't had a girlfriend in a couple of years, even though he was a good-looking guy. It was well past midnight when Jasmine and I fell asleep. We were cuddled up in one sleeping bag, the front thrown open, so that our bodies could cool down after having sex. Jasmine fell asleep immediately. She lay on her side, her arm draped over my chest, and her head buried into my shoulder. I stayed up, listening to the creaking of tree branches and the rustling of the tent by the wind. It was blissful, and before long I was asleep as well. I was woken up by Jasmine shaking my shoulder. I was drowsy from the weed and the alcohol, and I didn't know exactly what was happening. It was pitch black outside and inside the tent, and the air outside the sleeping bag was cold as ice. Jasmine was saying something to me in a hushed, trembling voice. My head finally cleared when I realized something was wrong. I asked her what was happening, thinking that maybe a wild animal was outside the tent. Black and brown bears inhabited the area, along with mountain lions, bobcats, and many varieties of snakes. Those people with the mask are outside, Jasmine said, kneeling beside me, staring toward the front of the tent. The zipper was closed, so I couldn't see anything, and I briefly wondered if Jasmine had a nightmare and wasn't quite awake yet. I asked if she was dreaming, but she stopped me from speaking further with a finger against my mouth, and then whispered, "I went to go pee and saw them with my flashlight." She was clearly terrified, and Jasmine is not the type of person to make a joke or to do a prank like this. I grabbed my jeans and shirt, and then, as quietly as possible, I gathered my shoes that were lying next to the tent opening. "Where did you see them?" I asked Jasmine as I put my clothes on. "There were 2 people about 50 feet from our campground," she said, pointing in the direction they'd come, "and they both had that same mask on." At the mention of masks, my stomach dropped. What I had hoped was just lost campers sounded now like people with bad intentions. I sat in the tent listening for footsteps, but I couldn't hear anything. Not even the wind made a sound. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears, and I could feel panic rising up through my stomach and into my brain. "Stay here," I whispered to Jasmine. "I'm going to get Vance and Eric." Before I left the tent, I grabbed the flashlight from Jasmine, and then quickly kissed her on the forehead and smoothed down her hair, hoping to calm her down. She was shaking, and I did my best to comfort her by putting my arm around her. I quietly unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold black night. I didn't want to turn on the flashlight until I'd back up. Eric and Lacey were camped deeper in the woods, about 30 feet to our right and back behind us. Vance's tent was only a few feet to my left, so I went to him first. "Vance," I whispered, hoping that he could hear me. I didn't want to speak too loudly in case I alerted the strangers to my presence. "Vance," I said again, this time a little louder. I heard rustling inside the tent, and then Vance unzipped the front and poked his head out. "Jasmine saw those people from the quarry in our camp just a minute ago." I looked around to make sure that nobody was watching us, but I couldn't see more than perhaps 10 feet in front of me because it was so dark. I dared not turn on my flashlight until Vance was ready. If the two creeps thought they were frightening, just wait until they saw Big Irish coming at them from the pitch-black night. "Shit," was all Vance said. He ducked back inside the tent and hurriedly got dressed. As I waited for him, I peered into the forest, hoping they'd be gone. I listened for sounds of voices, of twigs snapping in the distance, anything that would alert me to the presence of others. But there was not a sound other than the chilly wind brushing the leaves of trees. The sun was still below the horizon, and the trees that formed a ring around our camp felt like a prison. It was so thoroughly dark that I couldn't even see my van, even though it wasn't more than 30 feet south of our camp. Whatever starlight might have aided me that night was obscured by thick clouds, and distant thunder rumbled across the forest toward our camp. I looked around the tent for any large rocks to use as weapons, but there were only pine needles and loosely packed sand. Vance stumbled out of the tent straight to my back, and I toppled over onto my knees. "Sorry," Vance said, a little too loud. I picked myself up and quickly looked around for any sign that the strangers had heard us. Nothing. "Let's get Eric," I said. As we made our way over to Eric's tent, Vance turned on his flashlight and lit the way. He stopped in front of their tent and whispered Eric's name, but there was no return. I tensed and cursed to myself, hoping to wait until we had Eric before we exposed ourselves to whoever might be watching us. Since it was too late for that, however, I turned on my flashlight and shone the light all over our campground, expecting to see nothing but trees. Standing just inside a large pine southwest of our camp were two figures. At first, I thought I was imagining things, as if it was a trick of the light. But then one of them moved behind the trees, while the other just stood there, staring at us. They had on the same white oval mask that we'd seen at the quarry. Now, however, in the pitch black, with nothing but a dull flashlight trained on them, they looked like ghosts. Their bodies were invisible. The flashlight only reflected the white of the mask. They looked like floating heads, hovering just outside our camp, within the trees. Every hair on my body stood up straight, and the bottom dropped out of my stomach. "Vance!" I yelled. I moved closer to my tent, which is where Jasmine was. Vance, who was kneeling in front of Eric's tent, sprung up and shone his light in the direction of my light. I heard him take a sudden, sharp breath, and then he was trampling through the campground after the two figures. I heard him crash through some branches just as he got to where they had been standing, and then I heard a thud and a groan. I ran to Vance's aid. He had tripped over a tree root and was on the ground holding his ankle. I bent down to help him up. He slung an arm around my shoulders, and I walked him back to camp. "Did you see them?" he asked me as I helped him sit on a log next to our fire ring. "They're long gone," I said. Although I didn't know that for sure, I suspected that the sight of Big Irish flying through the woods scared the hell out of them, and that they weren't stupid enough to stick around. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah, I'll go get Eric and we'll search the area together." "Right. I'll get Jasmine and then meet you at his tent. She must be terrified right now." I walked the 20 feet over to my tent and unzipped it. Jasmine was sitting on her sleeping bag, her back resting against the back of the tent. "Tim, is everyone okay? What's happening?" Her words splashed out of her mouth. "They're gone. Vance scared them off. He's going to wake up Eric, and the two of them will search the area to make sure they're gone. I'll stay with you and Lacey." Jasmine looked relieved, but she still didn't move. "Come on," I said. "Let's go get Eric." Finally, she crawled out of the tent. I held her hand reassuringly as we walked over to Eric's tent. "Oh my God," Vance said, startled, thinking that the strangers had returned. I flung my flashlight in every direction, expecting someone to attack us at any moment. "Look," Vance said, training his flashlight on Eric's tent. "Something's wrong." I followed the light from his flashlight. He had walked to the back of Eric's tent while I was getting Jasmine. As I looked more closely at the tent, I realized that the shape was wrong. It was a dome tent, but the back had collapsed. I hadn't noticed from the front because it still held its normal shape. The back of the tent was sliced open from the top to the bottom, and the poles that crisscrossed over the dome were bent and pulled from the ground. There was no movement inside the tent, and my pulse raced as I pulled on one side of the sliced fabric, while Vance put on the other side. I crawled through the hole and trained my light on the floor of the tent. Eric and Lacey were in their sleeping bags, but there was no movement. My heart was in my throat. "Eric," I said, and gave him a nudge on his shoulder. His head was buried inside the bag, so I couldn't see him. I shook him again, a feeling of dread descending upon me. I slowly pulled on the sleeping bag, exposing Eric's face. In the harsh white light of the flashlight, the blood on Eric's face looked black. A deep gash, so deep that I could see the bone of his forehead and of his eye socket, ran from his hairline to his jaw, running right over his eye. I stared at it in disbelief, my mind telling me that it must be some kind of sick prank. But it wasn't. I dropped the sleeping bag and moved away, right onto the edge of Lacey's bag, screaming as I did so. "What's wrong?" Vance asked as he crawled through the tent opening. He took one look at Eric and leapt back out of the tent, letting out a loud, brutal scream. He dropped his flashlight at the opening of the tent and sprinted away, still screaming. Jasmine, still outside the tent, backed away from the opening and grabbed Vance by the arm. "Vance, calm down," she said, but her voice trembled. She'd never seen Vance act that way. None of us had. "Look," Vance said to Jasmine, pointing toward the tent. Jasmine poked her head through the opening. "Tim," was all she said before looking down at Eric, whose face was lit up by my flashlight. Jasmine let out a short, sharp squeal and then jumped out of the tent. She and Vance were in hysterics, both talking at the same time, neither making sense. But they weren't my concern at the moment. A strange calm came over me, and I felt as if I weren't inside the tent, but was looking down upon the scene from above. I turned around and checked Lacey's bag. Her head was rolled over and smushed against the side fabric of the tent. Her neck was cut so deep that only a few strands of muscle fiber kept her head attached to her body. Blood had pooled so heavily around her that when I took my hand away from her bag, it came away with a thick black ooze. At this point I must have blacked out, but it couldn't have been for long. Vance had dragged me out of the tent, and I awoke on the ground. Jasmine was sitting next to me, her knees drawn up to her chest, her back to Eric's tent, her head hanging down in between her legs. "Jasmine," I whispered, pulling myself onto my knees and gently laying my hand on her shoulder. The only response I received was a whispered groan. Vance was inside the tent. I could hear him rustling through the sleeping bags. Suddenly he was barging out of the tent, falling to his knees and getting sick on the ground. The entire scene made me sick to my stomach as well, and I headed out behind a tree and dry heaved until I could hardly catch a breath. After Vance finished getting sick, he walked quickly away from the scene, holding his phone as high as he could, attempting to get a signal. I stumbled toward Jasmine and picked her up by her arms. "Come on," I pleaded. "Get away from there." I was able to drag Jasmine away from the tent, but she was having trouble keeping her legs under her. I sat next to the fire pit and turned to Vance, who was unsuccessful in getting a signal. He was dialing 911 repeatedly, cursing as each attempt ended with his phone disconnecting the phone call. I drew in a deep breath and did my best to clear my head. I had to think rationally about our situation. We needed help. It never occurred to me that the people responsible for this massacre might still be around. "You two stay here. I'm going to drive up the road until I can get reception." Jasmine had yet to move. Vance looked at me and said, "Go. I'll keep Jasmine safe." He picked up the axe buried in some firewood next to the pit. "If they come back, I'll have something to show them." I had no doubt that Big Irish would unleash holy hell on anyone who dared enter our camp. Jasmine would be safe. Without saying another word, I grabbed my keys out of my pants pocket, hopped in the van, and took off down the dirt trail. It took 20 minutes for me to get to the main road that would take me southeast out of the mountains into civilization. There was a small gas station 30 miles down the road, but I pulled over as soon as I saw that my phone had a single reception bar. Besides, it was 3 in the morning. I doubted they were open. I dialed 911 and the call connected on the first try. I breathed a sigh of relief.
911, what's your emergency?
The call cut out. I screamed into the phone, pulled back onto the road, and despite the danger, sped as quickly as I could in the hopes of getting a better signal. Half a mile later, the road twisting like a snake through the foothills, I had 2 bars, so I pulled the car over onto the rough shoulder, slamming on the brakes so hard that I lost control of the van. Luckily, the tires caught on the gravel, and I came to a stop, the front half of the van on the shoulder and the back half on the road. I pulled the van fully onto the shoulder and then dialed 911, praying that this time the connection would not fail.
911, what's your emergency?
I cut her off again. I don't recall what I was saying, just that my throat hurt from screaming so loudly. "Sorry, you need to stop screaming. I can't understand you," she said, sounding irritated. I ignored her tone. "I'm camped on Forest Road 269, a couple miles south of the Quarry. Someone murdered my friends. They had masks on." The words tumbled out of my mouth and fell down my chest, one on top of another, in my desperate attempt to explain the situation. "You're on Forest Road 269? Did you say your friends were murdered? Speak slowly." I let out a tight scream and then composed myself. "Yes, 269, I said through gritted teeth. I clenched my jaw so hard that when I began to speak again, it ached with relief. "We're camped about 2 miles south of the Quarry. There are 5 of us. 2 people came into our tent and killed my friend and his girlfriend while they were sleeping." I tried to slow my heartbeat as I waited for the 911 operator to respond. It took her forever. "I have police on their way. Is anyone else hurt?" "No, please hurry. I don't know if they're going to come back." "So you don't know who did this?" She sounded skeptical, and that sent me over the edge. I began to scream at her. "They had on masks. We saw them 2 days ago when we arrived at the Quarry." She tried to cut in again, but I ignored her. "Just get here as fast as you can. I'm going to go back to check on my girlfriend. Are you still at the camp?" "Listen, you stupid bitch. I had to drive out of there to get a signal. Now I'm going back to make sure my friend and my girlfriend are safe. Hurry up." With that, I hung up the phone. I had no more patience for her. I drove as fast as I could, the tires squealing around each corner, the van threatening to topple over. My headlights bounced off the trees, creating a strobe effect and making it difficult to concentrate on the road. I made it back to the camp before the cops showed up. Vance and Jasmine were huddled in the middle of the camp near the fire pit. I parked the van but kept the headlights on just in case the murderers came back. I didn't want them sneaking up on us. "You left us," Jasmine screamed. Before I could respond, she wrapped her arms around me and buried her head in my chest, crying hysterically. I did my best to soothe her, but I was in such shock. I'm not sure I helped. All I could think to do was to gently rub her head and hold her tight. I told Vance and Jasmine about my phone call. Vance was visibly relieved. We all decided to stay near the van where it was safer. We were silent as we waited. I don't think any of us wanted to acknowledge what had happened. We just wanted the nightmare to go away. It took forever for the cops to come. 3 SUVs showed up. They were from Constant County Sheriff's Department. 2 more vehicles, green Jeeps, pulled in just behind the police. They were park rangers working in Marble State Park, about 10 miles west of our location. The lights on their cars flashed violently and the noise was deafening. As they jumped out of their vehicles, they trained their high-powered flashlights on us. The light was so bright that I had to shield my eyes with my hands, and I could hardly see. 2 cops approached us from the front, and I saw 3 others flank us on both sides. The guy nearest us, he was tall with broad shoulders and a booming voice, had his gun pointed straight at me, and the shouts for us to get on the ground with our hands visible came from all sides. I just knew the cops were going to shoot me, or us, and that my life was just about over. My adrenaline was pumping so hard that I began to involuntarily shake. Even with all the disorientation and panic, though, we did exactly as they said. The rest of the police officers took up positions around us. They finally turned their sirens off when they had secured the area, although the bruising lights continued flashing. We took turns being interviewed by the big cop who first approached us. His name was Sergeant Joe Lansky. He took each of us, one at a time, to the back of his car. Thankfully, he turned the lights off to his own vehicle so that we could see better, and we gave our statements. While we relayed our story to Sergeant Lansky, the remaining cops secured the area. They taped off a wide circle around the campground, including the tents. I don't know how long we'd been there when a white crime scene van showed up and began to investigate Eric and Lacey's tent. An ambulance also showed up, and we finished our interviews with Sergeant Lansky as the medics checked us for shock. I didn't hear Jasmine utter a word while she was in the ambulance. I walked over to speak to her, the first time I'd had a chance since the cops showed up, and she didn't even raise her head off of the bed in the ambulance to look at me. Vance joined me and also attempted to get her to speak, but it seemed as if her mind was somewhere else. Vance and I were able to communicate with each other, but when one of us burst into tears, the other would as well. We weren't mute like Jasmine, but we were in just as bad of shape. I've never seen Vance lose his mind before, and watching him tear at his hair, tears streaming down his face, and deep sobs coming from his soul, I couldn't recognize him. When I was finally able to look myself over as I climbed into the ambulance after Jasmine, I realized I'd wet my pants. I was so exhausted I didn't care when the medic noticed and asked me if I had a change of clothes. Jasmine was taken to the hospital in the ambulance. Vance and I followed in a cop car driven by a young officer named Joe Crumlin. We sat in the back like common criminals, and he apologized for that. It was clear to me that the police didn't believe we were guilty of killing our friends, which was a relief. While we drove the hour to the nearest hospital, Officer Crumlin told us a little of the history of the quarry. Unfortunately, Crumlin said in a soft voice, we've got all sorts of criminals and vagrants up in those hills behind the quarry. Mostly meth dealers. That quarry on the north side bumps up against private land. Lots of drug dealers. They patrol that area almost completely free of law enforcement. I imagine those 2 in masks were attempting to remove you from their territory. We'll do our best to find those 2. We've come across them before, but last time they were further east near the shallows. All 3 of us were released in the early afternoon. We'd each been given a strong relaxant to take the edge off, and before we left, a social worker approached us. Her name was Catherine. She reminded me of Eric's mom, and I burst out in tears again. I'd cried so much that I didn't think I had tears left in me. We spoke to Catherine for about an hour, and then we were driven back to the campground so we could pack up the van. Forensics was still at the camp, but the bodies in Eric's tent were gone. Our tents were taped off, and when I asked the police officer how we were to get our things, he told us that the only thing we were allowed to bring with us were my car keys, phone, and our wallets. We didn't argue. The policeman already had our items bagged for us, and we took them without us saying a word. We jumped into my van, half-dressed and wild. Before we left, the policeman told us that forensics would take weeks, probably months, to gather the evidence they needed. We might, he said, never get our clothes or tents back again. We didn't care. We had money to get home, and that was all we needed. To tell you the truth, none of us wanted anything from that camp anyways. Anything from that camp would be a reminder of the horror that we had gone through. Sure enough, a few months later, Detective Mayer called me and said that we could come get our things. I never bothered, and neither did Jasmine or Vance. For the next 6 months, we'd get phone calls from Detective Mayer and her partner, Detective Symes. They promised us that they'd never stop looking for the masked murderers, but we haven't heard from them in over a year. Vance is holding out hope that we'll get answers one day, but Jasmine and I feel like we've been forgotten, that our dead friends have been lost forever. I haven't been camping since the incident, and I have no plans to go again. I got rid of all my remaining camping supplies when we got home. Jasmine and I hung on for another few months, but the trauma of what we'd witnessed was too great for our relationship to overcome. She moved back in with her parents, and I haven't seen her or spoken to her in months. Vance has gone on a couple of camping trips. At both times he's been unable to sleep, and he is now contemplating quitting the hobby he once loved so much. I hope this story saves someone else from experiencing the horrors we did in the southern Sierra Nevada mountains. If you happen to find yourself camping off Road 269, and while hiking you come across a large quarry surrounded by tall cliffs, run and never look back.